Houses.
Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, this government has claimed that it has a comprehensive housing policy, but quite clearly the people of New Zealand haven't bought into it. And the recent polls that have been published only last night or yesterday show that there has been a significant slump in the support for the national government. And the reason given, and I agree with it, is that the government hasn't adequately dealt with New Zealand's housing crisis. So if the government has a comprehensive housing strategy, then most people in this country say that it is a comprehensively failed housing strategy, because it's a strategy which has apparently been aimed at accelerating house prices in Auckland to almost $1 million. And nobody in Auckland, apart from a few speculators, want to see that. And it's a policy which has apparently been designed to force skilled workers to leave Auckland or to stop them moving there simply because they can't afford to own a house there. And it appears to be a problem that's a strategy that intends for people on low incomes to live in cars or in tents or under bridges or in anything other than a decent family home, because those have been the results of this claimed comprehensive housing strategy. And the Prime Minister said today, quote, "A soundbite does not make a plan," unquote. Well, Mr Chairman, their plan doesn't even make a decent soundbite. And that's the truth of it, is a failed and minimalist strategy, if it's capable of being called a strategy at all. And this budget actually shows that that is the case, because it pays very, very little attention to the housing crisis. And in fact, the government doesn't even admit that it's a housing crisis, but a housing crisis it certainly is. And it's particularly cruel when so many poor families are really struggling to find somewhere to live, especially in Auckland, but also elsewhere. And large numbers of them have to move continually as massive rent increases force them out of one property after another. So it's a reverse ratcheting sort of an effect, where a person gets a property they can afford, the rents go up, they move down market to a worse property, and to chase lower rents, and this goes on and on and on, and eventually they end up living in cars. If that's a strategy, then it's not a strategy that this country needs. And Mr Chairman, there are clearly a number of significant causes behind this awful outcome. And the first is obviously the government's awful housing management, which has caused house prices to increase to a level where very few people can afford to buy them anymore. And it's caused by a government strategy or policy which encourages uncontrolled immigration to the point where it causes New Zealand far more damage than it does good. And it's a strategy that sees the selling off of state houses in the absence of an adequate state housing program. Now, nobody would mind if state houses were built and if more and better state houses were put in their place. But that is not the situation that's happening in New Zealand today. In fact, all the government is trying to do is to cast off its responsibilities for state houses to community organisations, and that's clearly not going to work. When you look at the particular estimates for the next 4 years, you'll see little or nothing that will solve the chronic New Zealand housing shortage. A total of $257 million over 4 years averages only $64 million a year, of which $200 million, or an average of $50 million a year, the lion's share of it is simply to top up the income-related rent subsidy. So there's really actually nothing much new in that. And there's also a provision for $41 million for emergency housing over 4 years. But that's only about $10 million a year. That's a drop in the bucket when you consider the sheer magnitude of emergency housing in New Zealand at the present time.
Cool. So, Minister, the Honourable